In November 1920, Ernie O'Malley, who was one of the most important figures, IRA men, in the War of Independence, was called to a meeting in Dublin. At the meeting was Richard McCarthy, Chief of Staff, and a couple of others of the GHQ staff. And according to O'Malley, the conversation went something like this. Mulcahy, before you go south, there is an operation the staff would like you to undertake. What do you think of the auxiliaries? O'Malley, they're a fine body of men and a tough problem. You're right, said Mulcahy. We must tackle them at once. The adjoining Cork brigades will cooperate in taking Macroom Castle, where there is an auxiliary company. I want you to capture Inistade, the headquarters of the auxiliaries in County Kilkenny. To which O'Malley replied, Kilkenny County has done little fighting. Mulcahy said, no problem, you will have help from the Waterford men. And to which O'Malley replied, Waterford hasn't done much either. Now that sentence, Waterford hasn't done much either, the first time that I saw it, I looked at it and I said, oh. And as a Waterford man, I began to research it, to look back into the sources, and to see if Waterford, and specifically East Waterford, Waterford City and its hinterland, had done much. Now, in the IRA and the War of Independence, the most important unit was the brigade. Brigades were organised within a county, and by 1921 there were 67 brigades in the country. Some counties had 3 or 4, like Cork. Mayo had 4, Galway had about 5. Other counties, such as Laois, Carlow, had just 1 brigade. Waterford had 2. And every brigade was different. Some of them, like the 3rd Cork Brigade, down here, were very active during the War of Independence. Similarly, the 3rd South Tipperary Brigade. Others, even within a county, could be different. The North Mayo Brigade did very little. The South Mayo Brigade was very active. So each brigade had a different story to tell. Waterford had 2 brigades. The first, or the Eastern Brigade. The second, the Western Brigade. Now part of Waterford was actually included in the Tipperary No. 3 Brigade. That was the hinterland of Carrick-on-Suir, up towards Clonea, Rathgorn. That was regarded as part of the Tipperary No. 3 Brigade. The No. 2 Brigade, the West Waterford Brigade, or as it's sometimes called the Dacia Brigade, have been very lucky. Between Sean and Sheila Murphy and Tommy Mooney, their exploits have been very well chronicled, covered by excellent books by both the Murphys and by Tommy Mooney. Nothing has been written about the East Waterford Brigade. I covered it in part in the book I did on the Irish Revolution, but actually specifically studying the East Waterford Brigade, nothing has been done on them. So this, in a way, is the first, the East Waterford Brigade. The key figure initially in the East Waterford Brigade was Willie Welch, the well-known GA referee. He had been a member of the IRB. He had joined the IRB in 1906. He had revived the IRB in Waterford. When the Volunteers were formed in 1914, he was key man behind the scenes in forming the Irish Volunteers in 1914. He stayed with the Irish Volunteers when the split came. Despite his best efforts, nothing happened because of confusion and counter-orders in 1916. And after 1916, he was instrumental in reorganising the brigade. At first there was just 1 brigade in Waterford, but in 1918 it was split into 2. Willie Welch was appointed Brigadier Command of the 1st Brigade, the East Waterford Brigade, and Pax Sweden commander of the 2nd Brigade, the West Waterford Brigade, and associated with Willie Welch was Sean Matthews, another key man in it. Now, after the key thing about East Waterford Brigade is that Sinn Féin failed to win the elections, either the by-election in 1918 or the general election, which meant Waterford was the only place in the south of Ireland where you could be a nationalist and not support Sinn Féin. You had the option of supporting the Irish Parliamentary Party. Now the brigade, as I say, was quite weak. It had the 3 battalions, total strength, they were very weak. Of the 3 battalions, there was about 450 men, spread in companies. Each parish had a company, and some of them were quite small. Ferrybank parish had about 20 men in its company. So it was very weak, very few arms, and crucially, they believed that they lacked the support of the people of Waterford. In 1919, before we go on to the activities of the brigade, it's worth looking at the enemy, the British Crown forces. As you can see, scattered throughout the county, there were 28 small police barracks, 6 in Waterford City, and within the East Waterford Brigade area, you had Callahan, you had Dunmore East, you had Tremor, Kill, Anstown, Holy Cross and Portlaw. And that was it. It's a very small area. And from 1920 on, you had a regiment of the British Army stationed in Waterford, the Devonshire Regiment. So within that small area of East Waterford, there was quite a concentration of Crown forces. Now if we move on now to 1919, there were 2 things that the IRA were asked to do. There were a few small engagements throughout the country, but in the whole of the country in 1919, there was relatively little fighting, ambushes, or anything like that. There were 2 key things: financing the revolution, raising money, and key for that was the Dáil loan. That was accounted for on a constituency basis. And we have very accurate figures as to how and where the money was raised. In all, about 350,000 was raised, a huge amount of money in 1919, and half of it was in Munster. And you can see Waterford County, 4,500. Cork, 3,800. Cork East, 6,500. Tipperary South, 4,400. Kilkenny South, 5,200. Wexford South, 4,400. All very much the same. So West Waterford was fine. But Waterford City, the total raise was a mere £636. And that in a way shows the lack of organisation and the lack of support for the IRA in East Waterford. The other thing that they were required to do were armed raids. And Jeremiah Cronin described one of them. We did raid a few private houses for arms. I myself took part in at least 2 of these raids on the house of Scully, an architect in Parnell Street, and on Bailey's in New Street. In Scully's we got 2 shotguns, and in Bailey's we got 1. I was in charge of a small party of 2 men. I was myself armed with a .32 revolver. My comrades were not armed. That shows you how few arms they had and how little they actually got, just shotguns. So again, poorly armed, poorly financed. But towards the end of 1919, significantly, an ex-British officer who had just returned from the front, Paddy Paul, joined the IRA and was quickly appointed the training officer of the East Waterford Brigade. Now in 1920, the war began to hot up. In April, you had the destruction of evacuated RIC barracks. An RIC barracks usually had between 4 and 7 men. If you were between 4 and 7 men, you could either defend the barracks or you could patrol the countryside. You can't do both. So the response of the authorities was to withdraw from a lot of the small barracks, Callahan, Holy Cross, Amstown. All of those were evacuated. And as soon as they were evacuated, as you can see here what Tom Brennan said about Callahan, we brought out a few gallons of petrol and set fire to the building to prevent its reoccupation. Holy Cross, William Keane was a bit more thorough. He brought along some gelignite as well as the petrol and completely destroyed the building. But under the guidance of Paddy Paul, who was becoming more and more influential, on the 18th of September, the first active piece, an attack on Kill RIC Barracks. Kill RIC Barracks, I don't think there's any trace of it there. There's the village, road out to the west, and there was the barracks. And if we look at a modern aerial photograph, the barracks was there, no trace of it left. Across the road now is the GA pitch. Now at this time the IRA had developed quite a good method of attacking barracks, occupied barracks. They would mobilise anything up to 80 men, most of them unarmed or with shotguns. About 60 of them, most of the men, would be split into groups, and their job was to isolate the village, to block every road by felling trees, whatever. To mount a guard at the blockade, and if they saw British forces coming, to open fire and then to retreat. And opening fire would alert the key men, the 20 or so men who were gathered around here. They would open fire on the barracks, and then, particularly a barrack, the kind of barracks that was there, they would approach it from the gable where there was no window. They would throw sticks of gelignite covered in mud onto the roof, and having lit them, they would explode and blow a hole in the roof. They would then pump paraffin or petrol into the roof, into the building, throw in a lighted straw, and when the building was on fire, the police would surrender. So that was the theory. And it worked in a lot of cases. It didn't work in Kill. The first thing that went wrong was when the IRA, the active men, came into the village, they saw one of the RIC men going into a pub. They tried to capture him to Sejun. A bit of a struggle broke out. The RIC man drew his pistol and fired a shot. That immediately alerted the others. So they opened fire from the barracks, which had been fortified with steel window covers and so on. The IRA men returned the fire, and there was an active firefight for about 10 minutes. And then they found the pump would not work to pump the petrol up onto the roof. And just then they heard a shotgun sound, and they thought British forces were coming, so they immediately withdrew. Now, two things about that. It showed that they could mobilise about 80 men, a bit of carelessness, not checking that the pump was working, and it could have been successful. But they withdrew without any casualties. But there was a fatal incident afterwards. The British closed down the barracks and moved the men to Portlaw. The sergeant in charge of the barracks, a Sergeant Cullinan, used to come about 2 or 3 times a week to visit his family who were living in the barracks. The sergeant was allowed to have his family in the barracks. A couple of local IRA men decided, hey, this is an opportunity, we can capture him and take his gun from him. When he was in the house, they approached the house, demanded that he surrender. He threw a grenade out through a top window, started firing with his revolver, and a young man who had just joined the volunteers named Power was killed in the aftermath. Now, Power is not usually known in Waterford how he was killed or anything like that, but he was the first casualty. The British then started to round up, and the first person they rounded up was Willie Walsh. According to IRA rules, the first thing that happens then is that the next in command takes over, and that was Paddy Paul. And Paddy Paul immediately started to try and get more activity into the brigade. And the first thing he did was he organised a small ambush in Ballyduff Glen, just out beyond Kilmeaden. And they would lie there for days. If a British Army lorry passed by, they would open fire. They wounded a couple of soldiers at various stages, didn't kill any of them, but again got the impression to the British that the IRA were becoming active. Now in November 1920, the West Waterford Brigade had a very notable success. They attacked Ardmore Police Station. Ardmore Police Station sent up signal lights to look for help from the British Army in Youghal. The British Army sent out a lorry load of soldiers, which ran into an ambush at Pickardstown, and that was the key target, the British Army reinforcements. The lorry crashed into the barricade. One soldier was killed, the other surrendered, and the IRA got 18 good service rifles, a couple of thousand rounds of ammunition, no casualties, a complete success. So, let's do the same in East Waterford. Now at this stage, there are very few barracks left. We can't attack them inside the city because the place is crawling with British troops. So what we'll do is we'll attack Tremor. And we'll use the same method. An attack on the barracks. They'll send up signal flares. The British Army will send out a lorry, maybe two, and that's our target. We'll attack that. Now at this stage, the brigade staff, Paddy Paul, William Keane, who's important later on in the story, Thomas Wiley, Matthew Knox. And there in the centre is Paddy Paul. Not the tallest man in the world, but very active. He doesn't look so impressive as, say, Mossy Roach or Frank Edwards, but there's Paddy Paul, the key man in the story of the East Waterford Brigade. Now, this is a drawing of the ambush. The old Tremor railway line running along there. The road came along, turned up there. Now, there was one difficulty. There was always two roads out of Tremor. The new road, the old road. And you would not know which one the British Army would use. So the only place they could stage an ambush was where the two roads met. The second thing that happened was the British Army sent not one, not two, but 4 lorries. And that becomes crucial. Paddy Paul had asked the West Waterford Brigade, who were quite experienced at this stage, and they sent 18 riflemen who were put here. There were 4 men there, another 18 shotgun men there, armed with shotguns only, on the railway embankment, ready to fire down. And the main force was along here, riflemen, shotgun men. Now, the whole idea was the 1 or 2 lorries were expected to come around. The first one would run into that barricade. They would be fired upon by the men up above. The other lorry would stop there, and the men here, here, and here would be able to pour fire on them from 3 directions. So on paper, it looked a solid plan. And in January 1921, on the 7th of January, they started to put it into action. The Waterford City men met at St. Albans, the psychiatric hospital, which they used as a storehouse, collected whatever guns they had, and marched through the rain out to Tremor, where they were joined by other men from the city, some men from Dunhill. The West Waterford men had commandeered 3 cars and had driven over from the west, and they were put in position. And when everybody was in position, there, and there, Paddy Paul led 5 men into Tremor, and they opened fire on the barracks. And as expected, The barracks, the RIC and the barracks immediately sent up signal flares. And after about 20 minutes firing, Paddy Paul led the 5 men back, and from that crossroads to Tramore, it's quite a distance, and that was going to present a problem, as we shall see. They just about reach near the crossroads when they hear the sound of firing. Firing had already started here. So they couldn't make their way through here. They had to cut across through the swamp and up there. And when Paddy Paul reached here, he found that things were in total disarray. The British had sent 4 lorries. One report says 2 of them came along here, the other 2 came down here. Now, it appears that one of the shotgun men, possibly under the influence of drink, discharged his shotgun just when the first lorry was there. The 4 lorries immediately stopped. The riflemen, remember now it's dark, it's almost midnight, couldn't see anything, it was too far away. All they can see is the flashes of rifles being fired by the British. And they try firing at that, but that's no good. So they withdraw. These men fire off their shotguns and they withdraw west. The 4 men here keep down and then withdraw again. But these men are trapped. There are both sides there, and the British Army start to work around there. John O'Brien from Dunhill, a shotgun man, the first man there, he's shot almost immediately and killed. Michael McGrath, a rifleman there, is also shot and killed. 2 men are injured. Michael Wiley, not too badly injured, and Nicky Whittle, who was wounded 3 times and was actually left for dead. Paddy Paul is up here, and he can't do anything. The whole thing has collapsed in a state of disorganisation. So he more or less says, get out as quick as you can. Most of the men managed to escape in the dark. The British came along, carried away the 2 bodies. When they came to Nicky Whittle, they apparently he was lying covered in blood. According to Nicky Whittle, they prodded him with bayonets and then left him, assuming he was dead. The British returned to their barracks with the 2 bodies. Nicky Whittle managed to crawl, and he had to crawl quite a distance. The first 2 houses he came to, he wasn't sure if he could trust them. So he kept going until he came to a house that he knew, and they took him in and sent word into Waterford City to rescue him. It was a disaster. The next day, the Waterford and Tramore Railway did a boom trade. People coming out to see the site of the ambush. Rumours went all over the city of dozens of people killed. They came out by special train, walked up there. The stones there are the remains of the barricade. By comparison, the RIC men, outside their barracks in Queen Street in Tramore, you can see the marks of the bullets and how proud they were that the sergeant and 7 men had resisted the attack. One of them was decorated for it. One of them was slightly wounded. Now, Thomas O'Brien was killed, as was Michael McGrath. Michael McGrath was identified because he had his trade union card in his pocket. He was a carpenter from Polbury. His funeral mass took place on the Wednesday in St. John's Church. The British Army surrounded the church and made it quite clear they would only allow 50 people, almost like the COVID. They would only allow 50 people in the funeral cortege. It looked like being a nasty situation, but the Bishop of Waterford and Dr. White, the Sinn Féin mayor, intervened and agreed with the British 50 men. Thomas O'Brien's body was not identified. He was a farmer from Dunhill. His family were advised by the volunteers, do not identify the body, because the British are likely to retaliate and burn down your house. So his body was claimed by Liam Raftis, the city manager, and later it was buried in Ballygunner, and later it was transferred to the family plot in Dunhill during the truce. Now, it had been a disaster. And the IRA at GHQ level were very good at analysing successful ambushes, what can we learn, and analysing unsuccessful ambushes. And they sent down a couple of men who interviewed all of the officers who were present at the ambush. And their conclusion, this is the conclusion of the IRA investigation into the ambush was far from suitable but the best available. Our force was not extended enough for a convoy of 4 lorries. As I say, 2 of them stopped completely outside, and that gave the British an overwhelming advantage. The Waterford number 2 men were too far. They should have been more to the rear of the barricade, nearer. And as a result of that, the fighting fell only on shotgun men. And they went to a lot of criticism about the verbal orders. There should be written orders. There should be a written way for it to retreat. There should be agreed signals with whistles. Waterford number 1 Brigade should not have undertaken such a large operation. Too big, as the men had never before fired a shot in anger. The men had neither the discipline, the morale, or the arms for such a fight, especially night fighting. And they mentioned indiscipline. They identified possibly 3, certainly one man, who were under the influence and who may have triggered the ambush by firing prematurely. They were very critical of it. In particular, they said Paddy Paul should not have been part of the diversionary attack. He should have been there at a command post at Pickardstown to command it. Now, in a way, what the GHQ was saying, that there's a logical progression in starting a guerrilla war. Stage 1, low-level activities, drilling, raids for arms. The number 1 Brigade had done that. Stage 2, attacks on individual policemen. That, in a way, is to accustom the men to killing. The Waterford Brigade had done that on a number of individual policemen, 2 of them in Cappoquin, 1 at the All Bridge, 1 at Lamy Bryan. Then you start fortified positions at police barracks. Then when the British retaliated raids, the men go on active service full-time. They form a flying column. And with the training, with the fact that they're devoted to it full-time, then they can start doing the ambushes. What the Waterford number 1 Brigade had tried to do was to go from stage 1 to stage 5 without going through the intermediary stages. Okay, that was the Pickardstown ambush. After that, Paddy Paul decided he needed to keep the men busy. So he planned another operation, about which very little is known. I've never seen it featured in any book. He decided an operation on the 7th of March. There will be a diversionary attack in Dunmore East RIC barracks this time. The opening span on Waterford Bridge to be raised. And it will be raised at a specific time, about 8:30. Because there were trains due in from Cork every night at about 9, and it usually contained British soldiers who were going to the barracks in Waterford. It was expected that they would get off at Waterford, and they would be on the north side, trapped by the raised bridge, and a couple of men on the top of Mount Misery, above the railway station, would start firing at them. And of course, that would bring the patrol which went around the city every night, moving towards the bridge, and they would be ambushed in the Glen and in Bridge Street. Quite an elaborate plan. The diversionary was on the constabulary barracks in Dunmore East. The building still stands. It was no longer recognisable as a RIC barracks. It's the ship, restaurant and bar. So that was to be attacked by a number of volunteers as a diversion. Next one would be the bridge. The opening span would be raised, and a couple of men up here would fire on British troops. That would draw a patrol down from the barracks there. And they were expected to come down Green Street, cross Ballybricken, down the Glen, down Bridge Street, towards there. And in Bridge Street and in the Glen, they will be fired upon by volunteers. Now, one advantage of staging an ambush in the city is you don't use rifles. It's up close, so revolvers are perfectly good. Shotguns are not too bad either. So it is more suited for the arms that the IRA had. And that was set for March the 7th, 1921. And on the evening of March the 7th, Jeremiah Cronin led 12 men out of Dunmore East, and for an hour kept the barracks there under attack. No casualties on either side, and as soon as he ran out of ammunition, Jeremiah Cronin retreated. At 8:30, 4 men entered the control box, the control room in the bridge, forced the operator there to raise the bridge, and then took the controls and the levers that were used for raising the bridge and threw them into the river. And then the train arrived, quite a number of British troops disembarked, and what happened? Nothing. No shots were fired in Waterford City. Neither from Mount Misery or from any ambush. Nothing happened. The next day, Paddy Paul went around asking why, and his men told him that Vice Brigadier William Keane, his second in command, had gone around to them individually and had said, "Don't take part. Why should you get shot for Paddy Paul?" Paddy Paul immediately dismissed William Keane, appointed Michael Bishop in his place, and the rest of the brigade officers essentially went on strike. They refused point blank to have anything to do with Paddy Paul anymore. On the 25th of May, they wrote to GHQ at a meeting of the brigade staff and battalion councils of the Waterford No. 1 Brigade, called to ascertain why the fighting was not being got on with in this brigade. It was the unanimous opinion of the meeting that the brigadier was not competent, with the result that orders issued by the brigadier were not carried out. At this stage, a new brigadier was called for. Now that's what they call a mutiny by the other officers in the brigade. We have now once again unity in our ranks, and we can promise GHQ the immediate full cooperation of this brigade in the great fight at present being waged by the gallant men of other brigades throughout the country. We would ask GHQ to communicate with the late brigadier, not that he was dead, just he'd been fired, and request him to hand over all communications, arms, etc. to the new brigadier, Michael Power Trelaw. Now that kind of message was absolutely anathema to GHQ. We're trying to structure it as a regular army, and the idea that officers could turn around and say, "We're not going to fight for this guy. We believe he's incompetent." So Richard McCarthy responds. He sent for Paddy Paul, and his view was summed up in a letter he wrote to Liam Lynch. The proceeding was entirely irregular. I have instructed the OC, that's Paddy Paul, that he must remain in charge of the brigade, and his orders must be obeyed by all officers in the brigade. No suspensions. And then he says, "Personally, I could not get any good of any officer in Waterford, or get any scrap of organisation in the brigade, until the present brigade commandant, that's Paddy Paul, took command. He has put the brigade on something like a satisfactory footing. I think his own work has been done in a very orderly, disciplined and complete manner. His principal offence in the eyes of those who are criticising him in this area probably is that he endeavours to make him do definite fighting work, and that he will not agree that talking about work or even planning work is work. That is an awful indictment of the other officers. And over again in the papers, and all these are in Richard McCarthy's papers, he's criticism. He says none of them are worth anything. So he has an immediate thing. Paddy Paul has very few men left who will take orders from him. And the rest of them will not fight until Paddy Paul is replaced. So he orders Liam Lynch to carry out a full review of the Waterford Brigades. Liam Lynch now is head of the 1st Southern Division. Again, a hugely important man in the War of Independence and a very, very active Republican. But in the meantime, you have 2 IRAs in Waterford. You have the small group led by Paddy Paul, who's trying to keep things going. And you've got the other group. And all they can do is low-level activity. Every brigade commander was required to send up a report once a month to GHQ. And in his May report, he talks about destruction of British Army supplies, digging trenches in roads, which is a favourite tactic of the IRA to stop the armoured cars of the British. Seizure of bicycles, again, that the British were using. And then he said in his May report, I was not responsible for the operation on the 25th of May, in which the City Battalion was brought from its base for the purpose of demolishing bridges. During the operation, which continued until the morning of the 26th of May, an enemy cyclist patrol came in contact with one of our sentries, whom they seriously wounded and died the following day from the effects. The enemy then retired to his base, leaving the outpost near the city boundary. 3 of our men were captured while returning to their homes. So again you have this almost competition between them. It went wrong for this man here, John O'Rourke. He was a scout, keeping watch during the night while the men dug the roads out near the Holy Cross. He had very bad eyesight. You could see the glasses on him. And he didn't notice a small British patrol approaching. And they shouted at him and they fired at him and he was badly wounded. He was taken to Butlerstown Castle, and when they tried to move him, he died on the roadside near Rees on his way. But the fact that they're arguing about who was responsible, Paddy Paul in a later interview says, they picked the wrong man to be a scout, never pick a man with bad eyesight. That kind of petty point scoring is terrible, and it shows you the state to which the brigade was reduced. Liam Lynch acted very quickly. He sent his trusted Lieutenant Sean Hyde. Sean Hyde came back to him, and then Liam Lynch acted. And essentially what he did was he amalgamated the brigades to be effective from the 1st of July. There would now be only one brigade in Waterford. Pax Sweden would be the brigade OC, Paddy Paul would be the training officer. Waterford City would be developed for action. A disgraceful free hand left to the enemy. And in another comment he says, they can walk around in pairs and in ones and twos and nobody lifts a hand or fires a shot. And he's determined to change that. And interestingly, the Lismore Battalion wasn't quite active. He transferred that into the Cork Brigade. And you can see there, this is now the Waterford Brigade. The 1st Battalion is divided into 2. A separate battalion is set up for the Nara Valley. The 3 East Waterford Battalions. This one now was the 4th Battalion joined the Cork 2nd Brigade. And interestingly, within 2 days of it joining the Cork 2nd Brigade, there's a foretaste of things to come. Because one of the things that Liam Lynch always wanted was get some men from the active area, send them into an inactive area, stir it up, shoot some British ground forces. They will react, and then you're on the cycle of violence. And within 2 days of them taking over, a small group of Cork men came into Tallow. linked up with a number of the West Waterford men, and set up an ambush on Tallow Main Street, and killed one constable, Francis Creedon, and a couple of others. That was what the whole idea of amalgamating the brigade was: push the active men into inactive areas, and that we'll see then what happens. So to summarise, the East Waterford Brigade was not one of the more glorious brigades. And I think a key part was the perceived lack of popular support. Paddy Paul was a good officer, but he failed to gain the trust of his men. He failed to bring them with him. And there was a lot of arguments, and it got so petty. It was alleged in one meeting, and the meeting broke up in disorder, that Paddy Paul and all belonging to him had voted for Captain Redmond in the general election in 1918. Now, how they could have known how anybody voted. But that was the level of distrust and argument among them. They didn't have the resources, the arms, the finance, the blame culture. But they did tie down the enemy forces. A certain number of RIC, and in particular the Devonshire Regiment, were tied down. And we should also remember and never forget, despite this apparent lack of success, the commitment and sacrifices of the volunteers. 4 dead, 2 seriously wounded, and quite a number were interned in places like Ballykindler, Curragh, the Spike Island and Beer Island. Dozens of them were interned. They made their sacrifices for the Republican cause as well. And it's important that we remember them. That's the one at Ballynathan, at the Pickardstown ambush, almost exactly near the spot where Nicky Whittle was wounded, very seriously wounded. And there's also a monument to John O'Rourke at Reese, on the side of the road. You always have to know where it is to find it. But we should not forget their sacrifice. Thanks.